So let me give you an extreme example of this
Okay.
to help illustrate the problem. So let's take a child who so desperately needs a functioning parent that Child Protective Services need to get involved. So that's how severe the problem is, right? So
Right.
what is the ultimate remedy that Child Protective Services have? It's to take the child out of the home and put them in another home, right? It's basically shifting the custody of the child to where they hope is a more functional environment. They don't actually have the ability to make this dysfunctional parent functional. They can order parenting classes, they can order substance abuse treatment, but at the end of the day, the state is basically powerless. If a parent's not going to be functional, then what they're going to do is shift custody.
Hi, Robert. It's good to see you again.
Good morning, Susan.
I'm so glad that I get to um, talk with you and discuss with you about the kinds of cases that are in my caseload and things that might be helpful on a lawyer mediator front. And I know we're both therapists, so we come from that perspective too. But here's the latest thing that I've been seeing a lot of. And I wanted to just discuss this back and forth because I know my clients love to listen to how I conceptualize things and the people that are able to even define them in different ways so we can grow and change and address things differently. So I'm seeing a lot of couples in my practice right now who have been divorced for quite a while. And their relationship, instead of becoming more, their parenting relationship, instead of becoming more amiable, has gotten more strained. And so there's less communication. And typically I have one person that's like really concerned about the kids, really addressing the emotional needs of the family. And the other parent in the separation has increased their distance and become, you would almost say, like uncooperative and just not following agreements, not really checking in, not really providing like emotional buffering on the situation of like tension and transitions and things like that. So I'm trying to devise how to help my clients emotionally around these things, but I also wanted to get a sense of how they can legally handle um, these these things that happen that sort of sabotage the emotional development for their kids. And that's just a perspective that the dominant parent has around who's the more engaged emotional parent. And so is it healthy? Isn't it healthy? Like how can you make it healthier? And I guess one of my biggest frames around this discussion is that even if there's tension, no matter what's going on with the other parent, how can one parent who's maybe noticing it's not exactly a perfect picture, how can they stay really focused on their kid and their own parenting instead of being diluting that with all this tension? Because sometimes I think that also is a part of the issue is staying focused on your own parenting, your own mission as a parent, no matter what's going on.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes. I mean, I think that's a good question. And I would kind of reframe that a little bit as the frustrated parent, what's in their locus of control? And do they have a legal remedy for the disappointment that they're experiencing in the other parent's co-parenting style?
Hmm.
I think it is natural for a parent who's divorced to, as an initial step, to be reaching out to the legal or the court system in order to um, have the um, unhealthy parent, shall we say, or the parent who's not leaning in,
Yeah.
reform their ways. Okay, and I think that's a natural impulse because I think some you can be frustrated in the relationship during the marriage with some person's co-parenting style, and then when you get divorced, hope that the legal system can help you address those same problems that not only you are experiencing, but that your children are experiencing. However, I think it's important to realize the limitations of the legal system in addressing these kind of problems. So let me give you an extreme example of this
Okay.
to help illustrate the problem. So let's take a child who so desperately needs a functioning parent that child protective services need to get involved. So that's how severe the problem is, right? So
Right.
what is the ultimate remedy that child protective services have? It's to take the child out of the home and
Mm.
put them in another home, right? It's basically shifting the custody of the child to where they hope is a more functional environment. They don't actually have the ability to make this dysfunctional parent functional. They can order parenting classes, they can order substance abuse treatment, but at the end of the day, the state is basically powerless. If a parent's not going to be functional, then what they're going to do is shift custody. So similarly, in family law court, if the court is observing that one parent isn't functional, their ultimate remedy is to simply shift custody to the more functional parent. Now,
Uh-huh.
that can be frustrating for a lot of clients because a lot of clients maybe they don't want full custody. They want to be able, they don't want to be a sole parent. They didn't envision that when they got divorced, they would become a single parent. What they really want is the non-functioning parent to become functional, to be loving, to be supportive, to be a good mother or father for the children, right? Now, again, um, in these instances, the court can order parenting classes, it can order substance abuse treatment, but if they're seeing that that the parent isn't isn't stepping up and doing the things that you would hope that a healthy parent would be doing, their ultimate remedy is just to shift custody to the functioning parent.
Right.
Um,
But that means it has to be a pretty severe situation, not just um a qualitative, like the parent lets their kid be on videos the whole time that they're with them or something. It has to be more severe.
exactly. Well, but the problem is that so then a parent may complain and say, look, I don't want to become a single parent, but I want when the child is at the other parent's house that
Right.
they're not playing video games all the time, that that parent is helping with the homework so that when the child comes to my house, they don't have, 4 days of homework that they need to accomplish in one day. And my point is that the court really can't solve that problem, right?
Right.
The
Right.
court could come to the conclusion of the child is way behind in school because one parent is never doing homework. Therefore, we're going to order that during school days, the child is always with the functioning parent and
Right.
and they can have, custody on the weekends, right? But
Mhm.
again, that's kind of the court's ultimate remedy. So I'm just highlighting this because I think it's important that clients realize that one, the court process is extremely cumbersome. So in order to even get these kind of issues in front of the court, it would take 9 months, to get in front of the court and probably a year and a half to get resolution. And
Right.
at the end of the day, the court really doesn't have the power to, transform that non-functioning parent. So the question is then, what is within your client's locus of control if they're not seeking just a shift in custody?
Right. So locus of control is interesting because sometimes I feel like what happens with these parents is they do make agreements, even the what are we calling the other person?
Non-functioning
The
or
non-functioning parent or the lesser functioning parent.
Mhm.
And that sometimes that parent doesn't keep agreements. So the functioning parent is taking a lot more on, just like what you said, like 4 days of homework, having to deal with the kids not showing up to school on time, maybe not going to their soccer practices, can't be in the game. That means like the consequence sort of hits the kid, but also the parent, the higher functioning parent is having to reinforce or try to enforce the agreements, right? Which doesn't often lead to any success either. So then that parent in the locus of control feels like that low functioning parent is in my field all the time because they're not functioning, right? So whether they're not coming to pick up the kid for visits or dropping them off late or showing up, with all their stuff at 11 o'clock at night because they forgot the books or whatever it is. So suddenly there's all this interference. right, in the field, so to speak. Um, and so what you're saying is like, there's really, unless that parent goes towards the courts and proves all these things and documents all these things, and they're really significant, would the court start pushing custody towards the more functioning parent, right? That would be the process.
Yes, and the court's ability, the court's stick to actually have the parent, let me phrase it this way. If the non-functioning parent is not motivated to lose custodial time,
Mhm.
right? Then the
Right,
court doesn't really have a stick to make sure they bring the children home at 8 instead of 10 p.m. at night, or to do the laundry before the drop off, or to
right,
get the
right.
children there on time.
Hmm.
And so I'm just saying that I can empathize, but with the frustration that that causes the functioning parent, but they have to realize, right, that that's not a viable outcome necessarily unless the other parent is truly motivated of, oh, I've got to get my act together because otherwise I'm going to lose custodial time. And so that motivation has to be there. So that has
Right.
to be a viable carrot. And the functioning parent would have to be committed to going through a very protracted and probably expensive legal process in order to have the court, wield the stick of losing custodial time.
And then there's people in between though, that could help, right? Either, a co-parenting therapist like myself, or um a parent coordinator. So let's like describe some of those roles. Like when you've worked with a parent coordinator and has that been, did you feel like that's a helpful person that can enforce some of these more qualitative agreements?
Yes. So a parenting coordinator, just to explain that to your clients. So a parenting coordinator is basically an arbitrator that the parents have agreed through contract to give authority to make little mini rulings about the parenting relationship. The authority of the parenting coordinator is defined by the parents themselves. So sometimes that authority may be arbitrate who gets what vacation time and when. Arbitrate if we can trade this day or that day. Um, if you could set it up so that if one parent is constantly late with the drop off, right? Like an example of 10 p.m. instead of 8 p.m., then there's some kind of agreed upon punishment that the parenting coordinator can impose,
Uh-huh.
right?
Hmm.
But it's important to keep in mind that that relationship well, at the end at the beginning of the path, the relationship has to be one a voluntary contract that both parties go in. You can set it up so the parenting coordinator has formal court authority, that they actually, if you can agree by contract that they have the same authority of the court. So the parenting coordinator, if it makes an order around custody, that's as if the court made an order
Right.
around custody. Um, or you can just set it up more informally that the parenting coordinator will make a ruling and both parents agree just to abide by the ruling.
Got it. Hmm.
So yes, so a parenting coordinator can step in, but again, it requires the non-functioning parent would have to be motivated by, I don't want to go to court. I don't want to spend time and money arguing about, when I'm dropping off the kids or whether or not I'm doing the homework. So therefore, if the parenting coordinator tells me to do something, I'm going to do it because the alternative is much worse. So again,
Right.
that has to be a carrot for the non-functioning parent to comply with what the parenting coordinator is, ordering.
Right. So sometimes the way people stay out of making agreements is they just don't comply, or keeping agreements. They just don't comply. And then in a way that tests the more functioning parent of what they're going to do about that. Right. And sometimes if custody isn't the carrot, custody time, like they aren't so eager to like have a whole weekend with their kids, and they might not show up that weekend or whatever it might be, then there's no really change because there's no motivation, right?
Yes,
Hmm.
which I think does I mean, which then begs the question of what does the functioning parent do in that,
Right.
circumstance?
Right, because it is that functioning parent to really think about what is the motivation here of the other parent to change or cooperate. And if there is nothing on the horizon that shows up as like that wasn't happening when we were parenting together under the same roof and it's not happening now, there's probably not going to be a lot of change happening. So I need to figure out as the functioning parent how I'm going to adjust to the situation best I can to help stabilize my kids is sort of where the focus becomes.
Yes, and I'll be very interested to hear from you in your role as a therapist of how you advise clients to do in those situations. But right before we get to that, another possible legal remedy. So within the mediation context,
Right,
what I try and do with my clients is to surface these problems while the parents are getting divorced, while they're putting together their parenting agreements, and to try and have both parents be as honest as possible about what their expectations are. Because I think it's better, for example, that let's say the non-functioning parent surfaces and admits and puts out there, I don't want to do homework with the kids, or I think the handoffs there should be leeway of a couple of hours with the handoffs. Having a handoff which has to be I have to get there within 5 minutes is ridiculous, right? I'd rather kind of correlate expectations about what the parenting expectations are between the two parents,
right,
so that we can work out agreements or even brainstorm creative ways in order to avoid these potential areas of conflict. Um, and in my experience, if parents can be honest and authentic with what their limitations are and their expectations, and even surface different parenting
right.
philosophies,
Hmm.
for example, I fully intend to let my children watch 4 hours of TV on the weekend, right? If they can surface that honestly in the
Hmm.
mediation and still commit to a particular parenting agreement, boundaries, and expectations, they're more likely to abide by those expectations, right? Because
Right.
let me make a case for a second for the non-functioning parent,
Yeah.
okay? The
Yes.
non-functioning parent feels that the functioning parent is imposing his or her expectations and philosophies of what it means to be a good parent. And often they are bucking against that sense of domination of what it means to show up emotionally for their children. And so they, as part of the divorce process and being free, right, of the functioning parent's expectations, they are going to parent as however they want, right? So I think it's better to kind of surface that as part of the mediation process, those emotional dynamics, to get clarity around them,
Mhm.
right? And
Right.
ordered so, and even it could be that that they agree to a parallel parenting path because they're able to acknowledge that they have different philosophies, and they're not going to, no parent's going to abide by or conform themselves to the other parent's philosophy.
Right. So the way that you presented the non-functioning parent is that their non-functioning might be that they do not want to be controlled by the functioning parent anymore. So they're going to push back and maybe even passive aggressively or push back. And so part of it is if you can get that out at the beginning of mediation or in mediation so that that can be kind of a part of the parent settlement agreement, like we're agreeing to that expectations are one way for this parent and one way for this parent, or this is what we can negotiate or compromise on in terms of like vacations or whatever it might be, times, or how homework's completed or what bonding looks like for each of us or that kind of thing. That's easier. So then you're not fighting through. You knew it's a prescription for the rest of the parenting system. Like we know this is an issue between you two, and this is how it's always going to look like. You both look at things very differently and come with different parenting philosophies. So we're just acknowledging that. But
Right. Because part of the functioning parent's frustration may be like, we have a parenting agreement
mhm,
about what it means to parent these children, and you are not following it. Right. So that's the source of the frustration. Then they're
right,
expending a lot of energy to get you to follow what they think are the agreements. Right. So it would
right,
be better, just to be clear, well, what are our agreements? And are we,
Mhm.
actually, we have to adjust our expectations of what we have agreed to. And I think a lot of people dodge because they don't go into the weeds around what this co-parenting relationship is going to look like, and what is it going to look like when the children are at my house, and what's going to look like when the children are at your house. They actually dodge that issue, and then the frustration arises, post the divorce finalizing.
Right. I also think there's the other caveat of people's translations of the agreements can be completely different, right? So, like this could be a suggestion versus like a directive, right? So I think sometimes that's important to just have this. I know I spend a lot of time like, what does the parent settlement agreement say? What does the court order say? And how do you, let's interpret it the same way, right? Because that can also be this area of conflict, right? You do it your way, I do it my way. But I think that's really interesting how the lesser functioning parent might be just fighting the idea of like not wanting to be controlled, and that might be just what it is. And in their house or in their time with their kid, it may look very different as in both houses, but it could be responsible and uh, not reportable, but it just might look very, very different from how the other person parents. And that we have to sort of make room for that in the system, in the parenting system. Like, can it be both ways? Can it be that, and it's not sort of talked about to the child like that's the wrong way, or you're always behind, or you're always late, or you're always unfed, or you're always unkept, like that the criticism of the other parent doesn't come across to the child so directly because it's of the difference. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, if the parents can kind of embrace, let's agree to disagree, kind of what good parenting looks like, that would be ideally in terms of messaging for the children. I agree, because, they've done a lot of research around divorce, and divorce per se is not harmful to children, but conflict around divorce is harmful to children. So if the children
Yeah,
are picking up that the parents are in conflict about their parenting styles, then obviously that can be harmful for their sense of.
right. Or I always think what the other part that I've seen in my adults that who have had a divorce childhood in their childhood is that they've talked about that the other parent, the higher functioning parent, never really addressed maybe the under functioning issues of the lesser functioning parent in real time. They always sort of like didn't talk about it, like ignored it because they just felt like they couldn't bring it up really without criticism. So they felt really like a sense of betrayal. Like you didn't, my other parent sleeps all weekend and no one ever did anything about that those are the kind of complaints, right? And so I wasn't allowed to come back to my other higher functioning parents home to be taken care of because that was just they were just like living the agreement of the parent settlement agreement, right? So I know when we talked earlier, we talked about how to empower the voice of the child at a certain age to start talking about, that their needs aren't being met. And that would be one of the more neutral voices that possibly both parents could hear instead of it being the voice of the higher functioning parent.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, and I think that's a good segue to kind of what are the therapeutic solutions that parents can adopt, or the functioning parent can adopt. So I think, yes, I would say that if the functioning parent can reframe what's going on for the child, not as a complaint that the functioning parent has about the non-functioning parent, but for compassion that the child has to deal with this dysfunction, and to equip them emotionally to cope with that reality. So, for example, there are a lot of people walking around the earth
Mhm.
who have diagnosable disorders, right?
Right.
Which may be anxiety disorders, depression, schizophrenia, substance abuse, whatever it is. And just because you get divorced from your partner, those problems do not go away. And they can't go away by court order,
Right.
and they may not go away unless, again, the individual is highly motivated to change their life. Um, And sometimes you know, they're kind of these disorders that are chemical and even beyond the control of the individual to shift. So what I advise my clients is that I think it's very important to do a couple of things. One, keep the lines of communication open with your children, that they are able to share with you about what their experience is being with a dysfunctional parent, so that you can become a listener,
Mhm.
almost like their therapist,
Right.
and give them compassion for that experience. Two, I think it's very important at a certain age for the functional parent to equip their child with a voice so that they can process with a dysfunctional parent how their dysfunction is affecting them, the child, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that is, I would say, from a tactical perspective, it is much more persuasive and motivating for the dysfunctional parent to hear how their behavior is affecting the child from the child themselves than to hear it from their divorced spouse, right?
Right.
There's
Mhm.
going to be a certain level of not believing the divorced spouse and also questioning their motives. But if the children are able to process, you know, with the dysfunctional parent, this is how your behavior affects me, this is what I need, you know, that's very empowering. That's very empowering. And it can be, and you have to keep in mind that that child is going to have that dysfunctional parent and their dysfunction for the rest of their lives. So it's really a life skill. So it's not so much that you're burdening the child to have to change the parent. It's more that you're giving the child a life skill to have a voice and
Mhm.
to surface their needs with this parent who's going to have this personality for the rest of the child's life. So obviously,
Right.
you know, this is age appropriate, right?
Right.
And I would say the third thing is to also just always know that the child has the ability, the channel to reach out to the functioning parent, so that if things get so bad, right, that they can let the functioning parent know that either they need to be picked up or that they need some help, you know, because things are kind of out of control.
Right. And maybe to have a person in there, whether it's the child has their own therapist, or each parent has their own therapist, that sometimes that person, if there's a person in between the parents, right, like a parent coordinator or co-parenting therapist, or um, that there can be communication about how um, things are addressed even more formally, like, okay, we're going to have a formal kind of agreement, just so that everyone understands, like, these are the steps that happen when it gets to the point that child needs to call the other parent, the higher functioning parent, because I think sometimes that's a pretty scary step, and for a child to take in, if there's like a system that supports, like, hey, this is just a natural thing that will happen, and we're all supporting that, and it's sort of like everyone's kind of notified about this, right? So if it's a weekend that's the child, like the parents in a depression or something, and really not able to get out of bed, that it's not going to be a punitive thing that the parent loses custody or something over that, but that we're working with that mental illness or that mental status issue at the moment, right? We're going to work through that with that person and understand it. And therefore it's not like another weapon, right? Because I think sometimes people hide these things because it becomes like a weaponized thing, mental illness and depression and anxiety and things like that.
Yeah. So what are some of the advice that you give clients when they come to you and they're faced with these kind of situations?
Well, I wanted to bring up one other thing, which was another professional that's pulled in sometimes, and just talk about that a little bit, in your experience with an evaluator, someone who's evaluating both parents to see where custody should lie, and just your experience with using one of those folks to do an evaluation of each household for the courts.
Well, so contextualize that. If an evaluator is being brought into this family dynamic, it's usually in the context that one or both parents feel that the other parent is not a good parent and should
Right.
not be having 50% of the time with the children.
Mhm.
So that sets up a dynamic where, on the one hand, the custody evaluator is inserting him or herself, trying to assess what's going on, but it's setting up a very kind of litigious dynamic in which basically both parents are telling all the bad things that they can about the other parent. Um, so, and often those custody evaluators are psychologists, but the way that the parties are engaging with them as a judge. Um, so anyway, so I just think that it's important to realize that if you're bringing in a custody evaluator, every bad thing you've ever done as a parent and the relationship is definitely going to be surfaced in that process. And the second thing is that the custody evaluators will interview the children, and in the worst case, the children are going to feel torn and perhaps that they're betraying one of their parents
Mhm.
by telling the custody evaluator the truth. In the
Right.
best case, it is an opportunity for a third party to get involved, that if bad things are happening, then the children have an outlet in which to report kind of very bad dynamics, and hopefully the children will be will be believed by the custody evaluator, where the court might be suspicious of accusations being made by a parent who, in the context of a divorce, the court just may have suspicion of, like, oh, you're just throwing mud on the walls because you want more custody, more money, or something like that. Um,
Right. I think with an evaluator, I've seen, usually that's kind of the end of the line. Like people aren't probably going to get along too well after that, parents. And so I think it sort of sets up more of a parallel parenting model going from that. So that's how I've seen it work. I also have seen that sometimes people disagree with it so much they won't you know, cooperate with that either. So there's sometimes that's another angle that I think happens. But I do feel like it leads not to working things out as much as having two separate worlds for that child to go back and forth into, however that works out.
Yes, I mean, I agree emotionally. That's likely to be the effect on the co-parenting relationship. And I guess people, because I didn't state this, should understand that legally, the custody evaluation makes an evaluation against, then gets submitted to the court, to the
Right.
judge,
Mhm.
and the judge then considers that evaluation when making a ruling on custody.
Right. Right. And I think sometimes it's completely necessary to go to that level because people just don't know what's going on and there's a lot of accusation, right? So it's important to get to that level at that higher level if kids are feeling unsafe or the other parent is really extremely uncomfortable with the mental health of the other parent. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the angles.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Susan. So now that we've kind of scoped through the limitations of the legal process, so let's think of a scenario where the non-functioning parent, despite a legal parenting agreement that the handoffs are supposed to occur at 8 p.m. every Sunday, constantly brings the children back at 10 p.m. every Sunday, really messing with the children's schedule, their ability to get ready the next day for, school. But the remedy for that is going to require tons of money, long time in court. How do you work with clients emotionally to either reframe their locus of control, or to give them tools to kind of handle those kind of situations?
Right. So when I'm doing co-parenting with people and we've made some custody agreements about drop-off times, pickup times, things that are important for kids, just routines and things like that. Um, I do two things. I really rely on my relationship with both of the parents separately. And so I often coach parents separately when I'm working with them, right? Because I don't want to be coaching them together because then it becomes very punitive or um I also think people have their own private matters that they need to deal with in terms of their own parenting. So a lot of times I'm working on, when I'm meeting with each parent separately, I'm working on their parenting issues or their parenting weaknesses or even their understanding behaviorally about what's important for their kids at their stage of development. So I'm really trying to hone into each parent and align with each parent and their motivations and their capacities and their limitations. But let's say um, you have somebody waiting for their kid every Sunday night at 10 o'clock, and it's a big school week, right? Lots of activities, lots of homework due, lots of attention needed for the school day, and that continues to happen. With the parent who it happens to, who might be, let's say, that more functional parent who kind of runs is the executive to the kid, like runs their life in a way, like make sure that they've got everything they need, and that's that parent. um, that I would work with them to stay very focused on bridging the gap with their kids right away, like not going into their own tension. Because a lot of times what I think happens with in co-parenting relationships that are full of conflict is the child's missed completely. The parenting of that child is sort of the last thing on that's looked at. What's looked at a lot, and time is spent a lot on conflict instead of how to focus on the child. So I would ask the parent to really um, drop the conflict when that child walks into the door, and just address parenting that child as best as they can, because no matter what situation you're in with your co-parent, you have to parent. And the more distracted you are, the more triggered you are, the more in your own anger you are, the less available you are to your kid, and the more that child's picking up that experience and also feeling very alienated from you, or like lots of maybe emotions going on that they can't even describe because you're not available for that. And maybe there's a lot of protection of the other parent and a lot of anger towards the other parent that they can't show either. So it just creates like a lot of kids really compartmentalizing a lot of their emotions, right? So I would hone into that functional parent or that drop off parent and try to get them to center themselves, to anticipate that happening, to really gray rock. And this is a technique that a lot of my parents use, is that they just try not to have emotions around the other parent during drop off. They really just try to be like, clear slate. No emotions, no interaction, no volatility, because that other parent's waiting too for a reaction, right? They're waiting for a reaction. um so that's that parent. I really try to get them to continue to keep their focus on the parenting and let the disagreement land in my sessions, right? And so then I would and I would ask people, you have the ability to tell on the other person to me if you want, just let me know what's going on so I can and I tell the group, like, so I can reach out to whoever's not following the agreement and figure out what happened. Like, did you sign up for an agreement you couldn't follow? And maybe we need to adjust that agreement. So some things would, going back to the parent who's not able to do that, I would look at, is it passive aggressive? Is it time management issues? Is it, I don't want to have this agreement. I don't want to be away from my family. I'm just acting out because I don't want this. So I'm not gonna do it, right? I'm just gonna do whatever I want. So so sometimes and there's a lot of parents that I work with that have that philosophy. They're just not going to follow the rules. They're going to come to the sessions, but they're not going to follow the rules, and if it gets too hard, they're going to leave. So so I'm walking that line a lot with people, but I also try to empathize with what it is that's going on with them, and then come back to more of their try to get them to see their kid in the picture instead of the other parent. So it might be, the routine and the waking up and the tiredness, or the structure that that child needs at that certain age, and then come into some kind of how could it work. And typically when I have a parent that's dropping their kid off at 10, what they really want is to drop that kid off in the morning at school. And for some reason, that's not the agreement, and they want that agreement. So they're just kind of doing it. They're spending that evening, that precious evening time with their child, and mad that they're not able to spend the night. So I would either negotiate that if I felt like there was other things that were happening that were healthy, like communication between parents about what's happening with your child, like how's your child doing, or I would or if I felt like it was just the parent just wanted what they wanted and they didn't want to follow the rules, then I would also look at that. Like, is that there, like what you said with the parent coordinator, is there has to be some kind of consequence, right? There has to be some kind of consequence for behaviors and things that aren't done. So I would really look at that and talk about it that way. There's got to be a consequence. So if you can't follow this, you can't really get that, right? So maybe there's a build up to that, and that we start looking at giving you extra time if you feel like you can do the parenting um arrangement that we've all agreed on, right? And you need more caveat in it. You need more difference in it. So tell us what that is. With the other parent, sometimes I would even go into the bend of the agreement is if the child's not there, then it's a call, and then it's a and I would say this out loud to both of them. The other option, there's a call, there's a do I have to come and get them, or maybe they don't get to spend the night. Maybe the drop off time is earlier. It's like before dinner, so it doesn't interrupt the schedule at all. I would ask for that.
So Susan, I think that's really a lot of wisdom that you shared in terms of bridging the gap with the children and focusing energies there. And I really appreciated what you talked about, your ability to work with two parents and work with the dysfunctional parents and be curious about perhaps why they're behaving in the way that they're behaving. So I had a question, a follow-up question. Do you ever work just individually with clients when you're not meeting with both parents, like not doing co-parenting, but just only working with one parent? And then do you have kind of different advice or a different way of helping them cope with this type of situation?
Yes. So a lot of times I get before people come into co-parenting, whether they do that or not, because sometimes both parties have to really be cooperative there, wanting to improve the parenting, wanting to parent with the other person, or figure out how to move into more of a parallel parenting situation, which we talked about earlier. Sometimes people call me just to say, I don't even know how to get my person to even want to talk to me, let alone talk to you. So would you be willing to talk to me to help me figure out how to handle all this stuff? Because I'm getting no response or whatever their situation is. So I will work with people one on one to help kind of grow their ideas about either the limitations of the co-parenting and working on accepting the situation they're in and how much impact they can have on the other parent or their child in that situation. Or I'm also working with them sometimes I think it's important to help people look at how did this happen? How did I get into this? How did this go from having a baby together to this? And really work through them understanding more about the personality that they're interfacing with around raising a child, like really understanding who that person is instead of projecting onto that person who they want them to be or who they feel like they are, because sometimes that's not accurate. So I oftentimes feel like when people are not accepting the situation or they're really panicked or grieving, grieving the loss of the idea that they had in their head about how they were going to raise this child, how they start strategizing how they're going to handle it better, the situation they're in. Because a lot of times people come in very panicked, very angry, working with either a person that they're pursuing or working with a person that's withdrawn from them, and won't be communicating with them like that. There needs to be some understanding, like how did it get to that point? And then from there, I can help them create some kind of plan for themselves, even if they don't get the cooperation of the other parent, of how they're going to parent. So then I always look at that as like they're coming up for air now. They're actually seeing, okay, this is a situation I'm in. I have to handle it. I have to deal with it. And then we start approaching like, looking at how they communicate with the other person. Because usually there's something in the other parent that is very triggering, obviously, to the parent that's shutting down or withdrawing, right? Like if you don't, and usually it's perceived control, like that person's just trying to control me. And so I start looking at how is that person's behavior, the one that's coming in and seeking advice, affecting the scenario too. can they look at how they're dealing with it? Um, yeah, so I'll work with that person for a period of time. Of course, if they were like, okay, well, now I want to pull the other person in, then I say only if the other person knows I've been working with you to prepare you to this time until they're ready. And I'll have a few sessions with the other person, just kind of catching up my alignment with them so that they feel like I'm a neutral party going into any co-parenting. And maybe that isn't the case. Maybe I'll always be sort of that strategy person for one of the co-parents, and they will find a new person to work with.
Yeah.
But I think that it's been really helpful to keep people stable. And my whole reason for doing the work is I used to work with a lot of kids and I felt like their parents were not focusing on parenting. And so if I can get people to focus on parenting and what their parenting challenges are just in their personality and their style of parenting, then I feel like I can help that kid. So for me, even having one-on-one time with parents for a period of time until they go to their next step. They might not be with me forever. It might just be a until they
Right.
get to the place where they can have more conversations with the other co-parent.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates with me. I think that divorce can be an opportunity for self-growth,
Hmm.
right? Obviously, it's this horrible event, but it can also be an opportunity for self-growth and being able to reflect upon the past, what it was that attracted you to this type of personality, what changes do you need to make internally in order to find a healthy relationship moving on. And I think part of being able to do that is to grieve the loss of
Hmm.
this relationship, but also to grieve um, that this co-parent may continue not to show up in the way that you would want them to or is the ideal for your children, um, and to grieve that you can't change them. And I think that there's something around um, moving through the grieving process and kind of accepting the reality to a certain point, right? Obviously, if there's extreme dysfunctions and abuse or
Right.
addiction, that
Hmm.
that needs to be something you address. But accepting the reality of that this is who this person is. I can't change them. Moving through the grieving process and just resigning yourself to this is how this person's going to parent. There's a limit to how much I can change them. And I think it's important because otherwise you are in a state of perpetual powerlessness in
Hmm.
terms of um, your relationship to that co-parent. And I think that's difficult for people to be in a state of perpetual powerlessness, right? We all want a sense of agency of what we can control in this world and how we can manifest, that.
Right. Right. And we were talking earlier about this idea about grief, right? And that people get stuck in grief. Of course, you have to go through grief. I mean, it is a thing to grieve the loss of the vision that you had about how you were going to raise your kid in a family scenario with another person. Um, and if you get stuck in the grief, it's interesting. I feel like a lot of my conversations are about people being in their grief and repeating where they are still grieving. Like, and it's usually, I always ask people in the first interview is like, what stage, here's the 5 stages of grief. Where do you get stuck? Where's the, and so a lot of times, you and I were talking about that we see people stuck in the anger stage and the bargaining stage. Like, if this person did it this way, then maybe it would work better and we could get through this. But actually, that's a stage of grief that they need to get through to know that they've done all the bargaining chips and the bargaining isn't working. That was just a hopeful thought that maybe I could still have that vision even if I wasn't married to that person or living in the same household as that person, right? I could still have the same vision of family. It is that stage of grief. I work in a lot of group scenarios with people to get them to heal further, even if they're in these co-parenting situations. Not with me, typically they're either doing one or the other, but um, they come in and I always tell them most people are in the group in stage 6. So there's 2 other stages after the 5 stages of grief, right? And I'll just repeat them really quickly. It's denial, sadness, depression, anger, bargaining, and then acceptance, which isn't a linear process. But in the people that are in my groups are usually there for a period of time in stage 6, which is looking at the part of their personality that might need to change to be able to get the kind of relationship they want, right? And so this might be the regrouping for them to work on themselves to figure like, even in this co-parenting scenario, I could change that part of my personality, whatever that is, that makes me difficult person or makes it hard to get along with me or whatever, or my willingness to look at there might be another way to parent, right? There might be another way to do this. And then the seventh stage, which I feel like is what is the empowering stage of being recovering from your grief, is the vision of what your life is going to look like, what you want it to look like. And I tell people it's not just like you say what it is and then you get it. It's like you practice it every day, right? The vision of the life that you want. And that might mean the life that you want to be a parent and the way you wanted to do that on a daily basis and interact with your co-parent no matter what they do. You're continuing to have this healthier vision of your interactions with people in your world, right? And your focus is to say in your most conscious place, raising your child, without all this tension. So that's some of what I think is empowering about doing healing work on yourself during this time of if things aren't going well in your co-parenting relationship. What do
Yeah.
you think about that?
Yeah, I think I'm left kind of with I'm kind of hearing the voice of the functional parent of like, but what do I do about my children, right? Because I'm so concerned about their well-being, and I think there still is an area of empowerment in what you were talking about, in that, as you said, you can lean into your children, you can bridge the gap, you can be attuned to them, and as we stated earlier, you can also equip your children emotionally
Mhm,
by
mhm,
surfacing their feelings, listening to their feelings, being curious, right? As opposed to complaining about the other parent, be curious about your children's well-being, and help empower them to deal with a world in which everyone's not perfect, in which we will confront a lot of dysfunction. And that empowerment for the children may be, that they can go to therapy and share their feelings, that they can speak out and assert their needs with the
mhm.
parent who's not functioning. Obviously, a lot of this is specific to their ages.
Yes.
But yes, I think that empowerment can really be found in the relationship that you create with your children.
Right. And we're not talking about working on yourself and the empowerment that you might find from just doing your grief process and really understanding it. We're not denying that it's not easy to see that your child might be unhappy or not taken care of in a way that makes them feel secure, or that there might be another scenario, parent late, stuff isn't with the kid, you heard that they stayed up too late. That we are not saying that that is an easy fix. Like that is going to be, how do you address those? Who do you address those with? Is the co-parent willing to come into some kind of dialogue with you somewhere? And if they aren't, we're still putting a big question mark. How will you handle that? Right.
yeah,
So there's many ways to handle that. Some of it is, you know, at times probably feeling really desperate that you can't change that. And how do you, as your child grows, empower them to start having a voice about that? And then everything has to be eyes wide open, right? In the
right.
scenario that you're in. We're not
Yeah,
like making pretend it's not, that it's all going to be much better if you work on yourself, you know?
yeah. And I think, to summarize, right, it's helpful. Like, I think what we've tried to capture in this video is understanding the what the legal system can do and can't do.
Mhm.
When a parenting coordinator can be helpful and the type of things that they can solve. What a co-parenting counselor can do and how effective they can or can't be with a dysfunctional parent. And at what stage do you need to just kind of let go that this is the reality and this is the best that you can accomplish. And always, in all of those options, kind of lean into your children, try and bridge the gap, and focus your energies on their well-being when they're with you.
Right. And hoping that you're coming from a more centered space in yourself so you can see clearer, because the tension or the upset fogs the vision, right? So we want to have eyes wide open. You're looking at your situation and your child all the time, right? But you're also really taking care of yourself in the whole process and working on yourself to be more centered and grounded and realistic about what your expectations should be in the
Yeah.
situation. Yeah. Well, good. I'm really hoping that these tips like helped out a few people that listen to this. And I know that people can get in touch with us if they have questions or just want to run something by us, and that's always welcomed. And there's links below. And so thanks again for taking the time to talk about these things with me and hash some of these concepts out a little bit further. It's
Yeah,
really
my pleasure. My pleasure.
okay. Until next time, Robert.
Yes.
All right. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. Bye-bye.